Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Ring with FAM, and welcome to another edition of our Heart to Heart series where we talk about criminal justice reform and how it impacts families across the country. Today, I'm really excited to have our guest help us talk about the issue of drug-free school zone laws, which are a particularly stupid kind of mandatory minimum sentence law. I want to briefly introduce them and then introduce the topic. First, we have Lauren Kersai. Lauren is a senior policy analyst at the Justice Action Network. Before that, she was a reporter, and she has written about this issue and has been an advocate to change these laws, especially in Tennessee, which is something we're going to talk about. I'm also happy to be joined by Calvin Bryant and Buell Moore, both Tennessee residents who have been directly impacted by drug-free school zone laws in that state. So just to set this up a little bit, FAM obviously is opposed to mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And the reason is that we think if you're going to use punishment, if you're going to use prison as a punishment, you have to make sure that the sentence that somebody gets fits the crime that they committed. And that requires you to understand the facts and circumstances of their offense. Oh my goodness, this is typical live television. Now somebody's cutting my grass, so I'm sorry if you hear that. That the punishment has to fit the crime. And mandatory minimum sentences laws don't allow for that type of precision, because normally what you want a judge to do is consider all the relevant facts and circumstances of a crime, including that the role that the person played and the harm that was caused, their culpability, everything. And mandatory minimums say all we're going to do is consider one factor. And a lot of times in drug cases, that's the weight that was involved in the sale or the transaction. In drug-free school zone laws, all that matters is were you within 1,000 feet of a school when you sold drugs. And so what happens is you sweep into these laws people who were not intended by the legislature to be covered. So it's already illegal to sell drugs to children. These laws make it such that your sentence can be quadrupled. Even if you sold drugs within 1,000 feet of a school on a summer day, at midnight when class isn't in session, even if there were no students or children involved, it's just the fact that you were within 1,000 feet of a school zone. And so even though it has this great noble sounding name and purpose, what we know from practice over the past 30 years is that these laws have really severely damaged families for no public safety benefit, because the crimes that they committed were not as serious as the punishments they received. And so I want to start with Lauren, because Lauren and her partner CJ at Reason a few years ago wrote like the seminal piece about the problem of drug-free school zone laws that really exposed this problem so bare. And so I want to ask you, Lauren, sort of, what did you find in that research? I think it was called The Myth of the Playground Pusher. And basically, what was the myth? What did you find that people would not have understood if they hadn't thought about this issue?
Yeah, I think, well, it was interesting. When I first pitched this story to an editor at Reason, even he didn't really understand what we wanted to write about. He was like, wait, so you want to do what? You want to make it easier to sell drugs to kids? And this is a libertarian organization, obviously. And so it's if they didn't even understand what this issue was, I think it's going to be very difficult to educate the general public. I mean, they sound like great laws, keep the drugs away from kids, make sure that people who are selling drugs to children are being punished more so than if they were just selling drugs, to someone outside of a school. But how they've been applied, what we've seen is because the size of the zones are so expansive, it ends up getting all of these people who they weren't even near children. They might have been in their own homes, like Calvin here, but also others in Tennessee. They might have been in their own homes, in their vehicles where they were pulled over outside of a school and, received these enhancements. And so it's totally just outside of the intent of the law, a lot of these states that have these. But the reason why CJ and I focused on Tennessee in particular is because Tennessee actually had public mapping data of all of the zones in the state. So one of the things that was interesting to me is like, oh, well, let's see just how covered the state is. Because when you hear it's 1,000 feet from a school, I mean, I'm not able to visualize really what 1,000 feet means. And so I wanted to see like how much of the state is covered by these zones. And so we were able to create maps of Tennessee and do some analysis of some of the counties that are in the state just to see how covered they were. Because at a certain point, you know, if they go beyond just the direct vicinity of a school, you end up, you know, encompassing entire cities, entire counties. And so therefore it kind of becomes pointless. So everyone could get an enhancement for this activity, no matter where they are in the city. And so I don't know if now is a good time to show some of the maps or.
Yeah, I think that's important to show because, you know, the idea is you would think these might be small areas where you would want an enhanced penalty. But as you said, because there's so many schools, playgrounds, parks, or things that are covered, entire cities get covered. So I think the visualization is important. So why don't you show some of those?
Sure. I think Alexis has to share her screen. Or is it showing right now? I can't tell. Sorry, I'm new to this. Okay, perfect. So this was one of the first maps that we created. And so I'm going to be really brief because I want others to be able to tell their stories and share their perspectives. But just so we all kind of have an understanding of what we're talking about in Tennessee, at least, there's over 8,500 drug-free school zones, and they cover roughly 5.5% of the entire state, so the entire area. But when you only isolate the zones to areas within a city limits, aka where people actually live, for the most part, it covers more than a quarter of the state. So we can go to the next slide and kind of dive into some of these counties. Next slide, please. Thanks. So Davidson County, where Nashville is, or it is Nashville, over 27% of the city is covered in a zone. And when you look at that, I mean, to me, that looks like more than 27%, but it's just, they're everywhere. And so you can really see when you actually are able to put these on a map, just how covered the city of Nashville is. Next slide, please. But one of the issues that we also discovered as we were doing this analysis and as we were looking at these zones is that so what a lot of people like to say is that, oh, well, this must just be an urban issue. This must just be like major cities. Well, what we found is that it's everywhere in the state of Tennessee. So for example, Sullivan County, it's a pretty rural county, 8.6% of the total area, again, that includes like everything, is within a drug-free school zone. But if we go to the next slide, we will see that if you isolate just the city areas within the county, 28% is covered, and that's more than Nashville. Okay, and then we can go to the next slide. Maury County, similar, it's very rural county. Well, I shouldn't say very rural. There are more rural counties in Tennessee, but it's one of the rural counties in Tennessee. Only 4%, if you're looking at the whole county, is a drug-free school zone. But if you go to the next slide, we'll see that this is actually the area like where cities are, and you'll see that 21% of that area is within a drug-free school zone, which is still less than Nashville, but close. Okay, and so in a couple cities, we'll just kind of go through these pretty quickly. There are some cities that are really covered, and you'll see here that Memphis, Tennessee, 38% is, which that looks like way more than 38% to me, but 38% of the area is within a drug-free school zone. I think the next slide we have Knoxville. So this is interesting. We actually, we saw that Knoxville was sending a lot of people, or the current population who is serving a sentence for a drug-free school zone enhancement were coming from Knoxville. But the city, and we had talked to, I think CJ talked to a prosecutor, defense attorney, someone in Knoxville who said that most of these cases are coming from East Knoxville, which is more of the Black population in that area. So you'll see that the entire city is 39% covered, which is already very covered. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that in East Knoxville is 58% covered. I mean, that's more than half of the entire area. And so it's really impossible to avoid these zones at that point. So if you just happen to get caught in one of these areas and you are even in possession of drugs, you're not even selling drugs in Tennessee, you can get hit with that enhancement. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And yeah, they've also created some really silly like areas. So you see the white lines, those are the drug-free school zones. But in this one city, we happened to zoom in. We were trying to find like the tiniest area that is not a drug-free school zone. Johnson City, there's one corner of a street that's like outside of a building that if you're standing within that 400 feet, it's not a drug-free school zone, but if you're just a little bit over to the right or the left, you'll get that enhancement. And so they just create these crazy areas that it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we can go to the next slide. I don't think I have any more actually. So, but that's my quick presentation about just how covered the state of Tennessee is. And I just also want to mention that these laws, they do apply, like I said before, to private residences, to vehicles. If you're pulled over and you're in these zones, you can be charged with that enhancement. And they also apply day or night. So it can be in the middle of the night, no children need to be present, schools can be closed, and you can still receive these enhancements. And so it's been a big issue in Tennessee and in states across the country who have all put forward these laws, some that have reformed them in recent years, which we can talk about in a bit because I don't want to hog all the time. But yeah, it's definitely.
Let me just ask you this. So what if they're overbroad? I mean, you know, people will say, okay, you're going to catch some people who you didn't mean to catch, but why is that a problem?
Well, it's a problem because the way that the laws are structured in Tennessee right now is that prosecutors have the sole discretion to charge these enhancements. And so, you know, if you're caught in a zone, it's up to the prosecutor as to whether or not they want to actually charge you with that enhanced sentence. But once they do that and you are convicted of the underlying offense, which is either possessing, selling, or whatever, possess for sale controlled substance, the judge has no choice but to impose that sentence. And the sentence is a mandatory minimum. And it's a higher classification than if you just were, if you weren't sentenced under that zone. So for example, like we have one case, and I know we're going to be talking about some other stories here too, but we have one case where a man was inside a private residence with other people. There was a drug warrant, and so police, you know, they broke down the door. This person had no arrest record, had never been convicted of anything before, and he was discovered to have a baggie of crack cocaine that weighed. I made this comparison because I had no idea what the amount was, but it basically it was equivalent to the weight of 2 blueberries, that's not heavy at all. It's not a lot. And he received a mandatory minimum of 15 years in prison. Now, a second-degree murder conviction will get you 15 years, but you can be out in 13. But because of the mandatory minimum nature of these laws, he has to serve the full 15 before he's eligible for release. And this was a private residence that was 800 feet from a park, I believe. And so if he were sentenced, you know, 200 feet, or if he were caught 200 feet away, that same crime would receive 6 years in prison. And so we're talking about extra years, and if you're a fiscal conservative, that's extra money that you're throwing at this problem, and you're not getting an enhanced public safety benefit from that. And so so the question of, you know, well, who cares? We kind of get a couple extra people in there. Well, we're talking about extra years, and that's like thousands of millions of dollars for no added public safety benefit whatsoever.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Is, you know, we have a finite anti-crime budget. And if you spend money locking up people who don't need to be there, who you didn't even intend to put there, you have less funding to do things that actually keep people safe. Mm-hmm. Now that's the fiscal and sort of, policy argument, but I want to talk about the personal argument and what we're doing to real people, because a lot of the times I don't think lawmakers understand this law might have been passed with the best of intentions at a time where they were really concerned about drugs and their impact on kids. And it isn't until they see how these laws play out that they realize they need to be changed. So I want to talk to Cal and Buell. And Cal, Calvin Bryant, I should mention, Nashville. Please tell us about your experience with these laws, why you're here, and why your story is relevant to this.
Hi, how y'all doing? My name is Calvin Bryant. I'm 34 years old from Nashville, Tennessee. Well, when I was 22 years old, in 2008, I was charged with the drug-free school zone. At that time, I had no idea what the school zone was, who it pertained to, or anything. I never even heard the terminology of a drug-free school zone. So when I was arrested, I had like a $350,000 bond, which is a high bond due to the indictments under the drug-free school zone. I went to trial twice. I had a hung jury, and within a year, I went back to trial and was found guilty and sentenced to 17 years at 100 in the Department of Correction. So when I got to the Department of Correction, what I quickly realized about the drug-free school zone was we wasn't allowed to take any classes. We wasn't allowed to participate in certain things that could better us as inmates at the time because we had 100%, and only two kinds of people have 100% in the Department of Correction, and it's the drug-free school zone, and some of them are child molesters and things of that nature. So it was a big shock to me. I didn't know what it was. Like I said at the time, it's any sale or delivery that takes place within 1,000 feet of a daycare, school, library, community center, or anything around. And I lived in the inner city, which was the Edgehill Project. So we were surrounded with all those churches and all. So I was held accountable for something I really didn't know. My transactions took place around 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night. So school was not in session. So during my time in prison, I spent 10 and a half years in prison. I appealed to every court, the appellate court, the Supreme Court, the federal courts on this drug-free school zone law, talking about how unfair it was with the school not being open and things like that. I got turned down on every level that I appealed it on. And I had ended up in 2018, I was blessed enough to have my case overturned through a federal court, but it wasn't overturned on the terms of the drug-free school zone. It was overturned due to ineffective system counsel. So if it wasn't for people like great organizations like the FAM organization reaching out to my family and keeping my story alive, I probably wouldn't be out to this day to be able to talk about it. But I got a blessing through the federal courts on another issue, not just the drug-free school zone. Basically, what I'm saying is, if it was just about the drug-free school zone, I would still be in prison to this day. I will have to serve 5 more years, which would be 15 at 100 for my first offense. I was a college student at the time, 22 years old, playing football a couple years before that. So it changed my life dramatically, and I'm just somebody that's really pushing for this law to be changed.
A lot of people who will listen to this and to your story will say, well, you did something wrong. Right. And so, I mean, was this something that was, were you on a bad path? Was this a one-time mistake? Well, why would people say, okay, yeah, I understand that punishment exceeded, sort of what you did?
First of all, I take full accountability for my actions. I was, in my particular case, I was helping a friend out to get drugs. He said he needed some help with some assistance. So I called on the individual. I facilitated a drug transaction. The drugs wasn't for me. I didn't profit anything from the drug transactions. The detectives, the DAs, and the judges knew this, but since I assisted him to get the drugs, I was charged with sale and delivery in the drug-free school zone. So even though I didn't profit from the transaction, I still was held accountable. But the individuals that did profit from the drug transaction, they never was held accountable. So my friend, I ended up finding out was a confidential informant. They let me do dealings with him 3 times. And he never went to jail about the dealings. I just went to jail for 10 and a half years. So I understand accountability, but I feel like when I was charged for the drug-free school zone, I feel like they over-sentenced me. Like I did more time than most people that committed second-degree murder do.
Well, maybe you can convince people that, because I know what you're doing now. And people will think, well, no, you should have served that time. But I think, why don't you talk about what you're up to now so people understand why someone like you didn't need to spend all that time in prison?
Oh, okay. Since I've been out, I started a nonprofit organization called Positive Inner City Kids, where I go around in the communities of Nashville, Tennessee, and help kids get the resources that they need to be successful. Since being released from prison, I've gotten my voting rights back. I worked at a juvenile facility for over a year until it closed down, and I'm just active in the community, just showing kids that even though you make one mistake, you can be held accountable for a lot of years. And I don't want anybody to take the path that I took. Like I said, when I caught this charge, I was a college student. So it's no exception for what you're doing in life, but one mistake can change a lot. But I just chose to turn my mess into a message and get out here and just spread the word of righteousness and just continue to strive in a positive direction. And right now I'm in a process of starting a lot of reentry programs for individuals that's getting out and helping family with anything they can, with anything I can assist them on, and especially getting the drug-free school zone out of here.
Well, first, congratulations on what you're doing, and it's great. I think people need to know that stuff because they fear anybody who gets out a little bit before their sentence ends.
Right.
You know, there's a risk, and a lot of times they don't realize people are so over sentenced that there's no difference.
Right.
I also want to say something you mentioned about a confidential informant. And Lauren, when we were, sort of lobbying for change of this law, there were prosecutors who were saying if you just reduce the school zone size from 1,000 feet to 500 feet, that was fine with them because they would just set up these staged buys at 499 feet so that they could still these sentences. And so it just seems to me that it's so clearly a game, and it's so clearly a way just to trap people who you want to stick with a higher sentence and then force them to plead guilty. Lauren, is that, like, when you guys looked at this, is that what you saw as well? Oh, you're on mute. Lauren, we can't hear you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm a millennial, but I'm just bad with technology. Anyway, sorry about that. So I was going to say, I can't remember the names of the cases, but there were, off the top of my head, they're in our story that we wrote, but there were a couple of cases where there was this young, I think he was either 19 or 20-year-old kid who he sold some mushrooms to a friend of his, but his friend turned out to be a confidential informant, and she chose the location, and the location just happened to be within a drug-free school zone. And so this kid got more than a decade of prison time when he had never been arrested or convicted of anything before. And so, and that's not an unusual circumstance. I think that we've seen these time and time again. Or, for example, I've heard that police will pull people over who are suspected of having, substances in their car, but they'll wait to pull them over until they're within 1,000 feet of a school or a park, just so they can get that enhancement. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, but I think it just goes back to showing that, like, it's up to the prosecutor if they want to charge these enhancements, and oftentimes it doesn't necessarily make sense how they determine who deserves this enhancement and who doesn't. And it also doesn't make a difference in drug use or even deterrence. Tennessee hasn't seen any measurable public safety benefit from these laws, and states that have reformed their drug-free school zones or have shrunken the size, or, for example, Utah made it so that the laws are only 100 feet, and it only applies during school hours or business hours. And they haven't seen any increase in crime or anything like that. So I think just probably should have said that off top. I mean, these laws just don't work. They're not doing what they're intended to do. And so, I mean, there's just a number of reasons why they need to be reformed. But yes, if we do shrink the size of these zones, they can still be used. I mean, the locations of the buys or whatever can still be set up within these zones. And we'll still see injustices. I think that this is a good first step for Tennessee. They're doing so.
All right. Well, maybe we'll wait for a second. I just want to reiterate that point. There's just no evidence that these laws work. And so we spend a lot of money keeping people in prison for an extra 5, 10, 20 years and getting no public safety benefit of that. And the opportunity cost is we're not using that money to do things that keep us safe. I just want to mention there's somebody who helped us fight for reform of these laws and told their story in a way that, is not always easy to do because you're exposing the worst thing that ever happened to you, but that's Terrence and Joy Davis. And I know they're watching. And so I just want to give a shout out to Terrence and Joy. Terrence is finally home from prison after serving a ridiculous sentence. He was, I think, mentioned in your story, Lauren, and Joy was an advocate for Terrence. And, the law wasn't changed in time to help them, but at least they're out now. So we're glad that he's free and that they're together. Buell, can you hear us? We'll just, if there's questions from the group, otherwise, I want to ask Cal, did you see other people any other people serving time for this type of offense? And how do these sentences compare to those?
I've seen a lot of individuals in prison serving time for this, but majority of them was coming out of like Knoxville, Murray County, where Columbia, Nashville. You get too many out of Shelby County, but I've seen people with 40 and 50 year sentences. Like, it was unbelievable. Some guys like got pulled over on the interstate and they actually measured from the interstate to the inner city schools. And guys got 40 years at 100 and things like that. So my 15 years at 100 was a lot of time, but it's a lot of worse situations out there. But I've seen some as small as 3 years at 100.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Just a point on, he said he didn't see too many out of Shelby County. One thing that was interesting, and this goes back to just prosecutorial discretion and how prosecutors are choosing to use these enhancements versus when they're not. We found that in Shelby County, actually, only 6 of the current drug-free school zone inmates right now come from Shelby County, whereas, and I don't have the number, I can probably pull it up here, but in Sullivan County, when I was talking about earlier, I think they've sent, let's see, Maury County sent 27. So Shelby, which is, a big county, much more populated, major city, they have only sent 6 people to prison, at least currently, whereas Maury County, which is a very, very rural county, has sent over 20. So just to put some perspective there, it just means that the prosecutor in Shelby County is not using this enhancement as much as in some of these rural counties, which just shows that they're just not applied equally across the state, which is another, I think, point that we want to mention.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm gonna try this one more time. Buell, I don't know if you can hear us, or if somebody in our staff is working with him to unmute himself. So I don't know if he can hear.
Hey, Kevin, we're working on it.
Oh, okay.
All right, we'll be back.
Okay. Buell's story is so compelling that I'm hoping you can hear it, but we're having technical difficulties here. Lauren, can you talk a little bit about the bill that's being considered by the legislature and how it would address this problem?
Sure. So what's exciting about Tennessee right now and why we're focusing on it today is also because they're looking at doing some reform there. And so a couple years ago, a bill was first proposed, and it unfortunately didn't make it through the process, but this has been a topic of conversation within the legislature. And so this year, because we've already had, and I think it's kind of deja vu, I was on a panel with Kevin and a couple others just a couple years ago, still talking about this. I think Buell was in attendance, but we did that panel, I think, a couple years ago, and got lawmakers thinking about this issue, talking about it. Unfortunately, didn't make it through the process. But this year, we have a renewed opportunity to pass some reform. And so right now, bills that are working their way through the House and the Senate, respectively, are both chaired by the House Judiciary Committee chairman and the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman. And what they would do is basically shrink the size of the zones in Tennessee from 1,000 feet to 500 feet, and give judges more discretion in sentencing, so that the sentences are no longer mandatory minimums. The judges will have some opportunities to impose a lesser sentence. And so there's a really big opportunity here to kind of reel these laws in to where the intention is still that if you're near a school or you're selling to children, you'll get that enhanced penalty if you're selling to a child. But if you're caught, excuse me, in a drug-free school zone, now judges will have more discretion, and that 100%, like, you have to serve the mandatory, 15 years, the full 15 years. You no longer will have to do that under this law. And so right now it passed the House Judiciary Committee. It passed the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously this week. And so they're still moving through the process. There's still hope that this will, become law in Tennessee. And I think Buell is unmuted, so I'm going to pause and let him tell his story.
Sounds like Buell's back with us. Hey, Buell, sorry for the technical
difficulty. I'm sorry. This is what you get when you deal with old people in technology. So.
That's okay. That's okay. We're glad you made it at all. I want to ask you to share your daughter's story and how it's impacted your family, and sort of like how this has impacted you all and opened your eyes to a problem you probably didn't know about until you experienced it firsthand.
Yes, now I've caught bits and pieces since the others have been talking, so I hope I don't step on something that they've said already. But as far as my wife and I, and she ended up selling drugs, and she lived, her apartment was within 1,000 foot of a school zone. Had she lived on the other side of the complex, I don't think she would have even been involved in the enhanced part of her sentencing. But anyways, how it's affected my wife and I, of course, there's several areas. It was the emotional, I think psychological and financial. Before this ever happened to us, I happened to be the guy that was the law and order guy. Since it hadn't affected our family up until this time, my whole attitude toward it was people ought to be sentenced and they ought to be sentenced hard. And that opinion was completely informed and that's one of the things that, if there's any fortunate thing that has come out of our circumstances, is that I've been educated to what the school zone law is, and upon being educated in it, and also having it affect my life, my attitude has totally changed now. And of course, we didn't realize that this could even happen to our daughter or to our lives, and it ended up doing that.
Well, go ahead. So she's serving she got an 8-year sentence.
8-year mandatory minimum. She's in about her 3rd year, I think, completing her 3rd year. And one of the ways it's impacted us, my wife and I have recently retired, and she is right now on the West End, and we're on the East End of Tennessee. Of course, one of the challenges to going and visitors is over a 600-mile round trip. That, of course, recently was in February. They do have things in the prison sentence, such as video visits. And while we've been able to do a few of them, the quality is a lot poorer than what we're exhibiting right now. So we've even quit the video visits because the quality is so low on. We do get to phone call her. We'll talk to her maybe once a week or so.
Yeah. No, it's got to be hard. We're clearly having difficulty, so we'll try to make this shorter rather than longer. I just want to say we've gotten a question from Terrence and Joy about retroactivity, and Buell, you're fighting for changes for this law, and it's a law that that doesn't even, it's not going to help your daughter. Why do you do that? I mean, how does that feel, knowing that, like, unless they make it retroactive, which it right now isn't, it's not gonna impact you?
Yeah, but we would still like to see the law changed, because we don't want others to be adversely affected like we have been as a family, and of course the people's loved ones. I can understand how it may be a whole lot harder on people that have children or are grandparents having to take care of the children, and that's one of the reasons we want to see it change, is because we don't want other families to be impacted the way we have.
Yeah, and you were breaking up, but she got an 8-year sentence for selling drugs in her own apartment. And how much time does she have left?
About 5 years.
And so, unless this law is retroactive, your only hope is if the governor would commute her sentence to get her home earlier. Otherwise, without retroactivity, you're not helped, right? Cal, I know you feel strongly about this, because if you hadn't got your ineffective assistance counsel claim, you would be still in prison. what do you think when lawmakers pass these laws? They've recognized, oh, they made a mistake and they overshot, but then they don't make it retroactive. And I think people don't know that that's what happens when we pass reforms, is that they don't fix it for the people whose stories were told to change the law in the first place. So what do you think about that?
Well, I feel very strong about retroactive because, like you say, if it wasn't for what happened in my situation, the blessing that I got, I'd still be in prison, regardless of me being a first-time offender. And it kind of made me look at it like, how can you use our injustice for justice for those that haven't even committed a crime yet? So you telling me you got people still sitting in prison, y'all know the law was wrong, but what if don't nobody ever commit a crime again? It don't affect nobody. You might as well try to make it retroactive where it can affect those lives, and they're like, you got people in there like 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
So, I just feel like it's wrong that they use our injustice for people justice that haven't even committed the crime yet.
Yeah, Lauren, somebody had asked in the group, they asked, what could people do if they have a drug-free school zone law in their state? What could they do to bring attention to, the problem? I mean, what do you think is the best way, knowing that, lawmakers, it's a good sounding law. I mean, it's one of those things where, like you said, I mean, you tell people we want to tackle drug-free school zone laws. It's like, well, oh, you want drugs in your school zones? And, it's not about that. But, how would you advise people who say, we've got one of these laws in our states that need reform?
Yeah, I mean, well, to hit on the retroactivity part first, I would say that, like Kevin just mentioned, the drug-free school zone reform, if you don't know what that means, it's really scary, or you just, it's hard. It's a hard sell. It's been a hard sell. And I would say that now in Tennessee, it seems like it's become quite a politically palatable issue. The fact that the Senate chose to put this on this list of 30 bills that they wanted to prioritize before they adjourn is, I think, a really positive sign. And just for perspective, I think with Tennessee, they haven't changed their sentencing laws in the past 20, 30 years. Like, this would be the first, and when I say sentencing laws, I mean the drug sentencing laws. I think this would be the first kind of major sentencing reform that the state has seen in quite some time. So I think that as we continue to do the education, as we still continue to have people telling their stories of how they've been impacted, how, Buell's daughter has to serve 5 more years for something that if she was on the other side of the complex, she would already be out, or she never would have been in, or something like that. And Calvin, sharing your story, I think that gets the attention of some lawmakers who, earlier, or maybe a couple years ago, we're just like, what's this issue? Now they're supportive. Maybe next year there's an opportunity to do something on this, or maybe we can push the governor to do something on this. So I would say that it does take time. Unfortunately, advocacy does take time. It does take time to educate people. But I would say I'm still hopeful that, given how far this has come already, even if it doesn't pass this year, I mean, we've gotten so much further than we have in years past. I think that we can only build upon that. But for folks in other states, when we're talking about these laws, I would just say, a lot of the arguments that were raised today, I mean, they just are applied in such a way that means that the same exact conduct. So if you sell drugs or sell marijuana or mushrooms, like the kid who was selling mushrooms or Molly or whatever before a concert, if you're selling it over here, you get 15 years. But if you sell it over here, you only get 3. Now, how does that make sense? I mean, just explaining it like that, because you can't, as a person who hears that, you can't make the argument like, oh, because they were standing here, they were more of a danger to public safety. I mean, you just can't do that if the school isn't anywhere near where that person was, or they didn't even know that they were near a park. And so as you actually explain what these laws do and what they mean, you'll be surprised with how many people will be on board with what you're saying. I mean, we both people who sponsored this bill in Tennessee, they're both Republicans, and they're the chairman of the judiciary committees in their chambers. And so, it's not like this is an issue that only resonates with some people. I think this is truly a bipartisan issue. It just takes some more time to educate people on why these laws don't work and have unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I should say, FAM was involved in changing New Jersey's drug-free school zone law a number of years ago, but recently, when he was governor of Indiana, Mike Pence signed into law a bill to reform their drug-free school zone law. Tennessee has 2 neighboring states, Kentucky and South Carolina, have reformed their school zone laws. Utah, you mentioned, has shrunk its zone and basically done away with the mandatory minimum. None of these states are witnessing crime waves or children being targeted by drug sales. I get a question for Cal and Buell. What's your advice to a family member dealing with having a loved one in prison under these drug-free school zone laws?
Well, my advice to them is just to stay positive and uplifted. One thing I had to do is know that anything can happen, man. Just keep praying, and miracles do happen. When you see something as wrong as the drug-free school zone law, it's only a matter of time before something is done about it. And I feel like this is a great time because I've never seen so much exposure given to the drug-free school zone law in Tennessee for as long as I served for it. So I just feel like just stay positive and uplifted, and just remember it's a nonviolent offense, so anything can happen, especially when it comes to pardons and changing laws and things of that nature. Just stay uplifted. Just stay positive. I'm a living witness. I mean, it's my testimony. I'm here.
Yeah. Buell, do you want to, how do you cope with it? What would you, I know you've talked to other families, and what do you recommend to them?
Well, I also agree with everything that Calvin has said. We feel the same way. Ourselves, which helped us not only with our daughter's addiction, but also helped us, to cope with the sentencing that's in prison. And we are very hopeful, especially with organizations like FAM advocating on our behalf, that something is going to happen. And we also, I would also say to any parent to advocate in any way you can. You have local politicians you can talk to. Each one of you have a state representative and a senator. And I would say make contact if you can and express your feelings on behalf of the change of this law.
Yeah, obviously that's sort of our mantra, is to get families involved. You guys are the best advocates, your constituents. You know how these laws are impacting people better than anybody else. I want to thank you guys. I'm going to give, if everybody wants a chance to make one last push. We're hopeful that in Tennessee, we're going to see change this year. Other states, Florida and some others, have laws that need to change in this regard. But as I said, across the country, we're seeing reforms not only in conservative states, but American Legislative Exchange Council has passed a resolution supporting change. People who in the past supported stricter mandatory minimum laws realize that this is a particularly stupid law that isn't making anybody safer. It's just wasting a lot of money and hurting families. So we're glad that that momentum is there. But I just want, if anybody wants to make any final points before we sign off, open to it. Why don't we, Lauren, I'll start with you. We'll go around the horn.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me in my first live stream. I'm excited to be here and share this issue. We published this story in, I think it was December 2017. So we've been working on this for a few years now, and change and progress sometimes is slow. It's not as quick as we would like to see it. And it's certainly, lawmakers are not on the same page as a lot of their constituents when it comes to these issues. But I think that's starting to change. And I think Tennessee is proof that, when you do the kind of advocacy work that FAM is doing, when you have the right resources to educate lawmakers on this issue, and you're able to really explain to them in terms that make sense to everybody, you'll start to see more support build. And so I'm hopeful that, we'll have some good news here, fingers crossed, in Tennessee at the end of their session, and that we'll start to see more reform in other states as well. But yeah, all it takes is continued advocacy, continue beating that drum, tell your stories if you're personally impacted by these laws, and lawmakers will listen. So yeah, anyway, thanks for having me here and highlighting this issue.
Sure. Cal, once again, we're so glad you're out, and we're glad you're doing great things. You're the example of what good can happen if we right size these laws. So thank you for the model that you've set, because it's important when people get out that they do well, and so that people realize that it's safe to to make these types of changes. Anything you want to share?
Yeah, I just want to thank y'all for having me as well. And I don't want anybody to fight this individually. So, we got to fight this as a whole. So I believe we stay unified and stay plugged in with a great organization like FAM. It's only a matter of time before we break down this drug-free school zone law. We'll just stay positive and uplifting. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if I don't shout out your lawyer, Daniel Horowitz, I'll feel terrible because
Yeah.
he's been an incredible advocate on this issue and
Blessing. Yeah.
Yeah. Buell, anything you want to share in closing?
Well, I also express just the way the other two have. Thank you for letting us be a part of this. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but we too are very thankful for FAM, and we believe progress is being made as long as we continue to talk about the subject. And I want to say to those out there who are going through this with people who are incarcerated, be optimistic about it, be proactive about it, and as Lauren said, tell people your story because that really does make a difference. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for joining us. This is the perils of video technology and the pandemic as we have these issues. But we are grateful for you guys taking this time to join us, talk about this issue. Like I said, we're hopeful for progress in Tennessee and pushing these laws back across the country. If people have any questions, and if you're watching this later, you didn't get to watch it live, if you have questions about this or any other issue, please drop them in the comments and our staff will respond to you. And if you are a family member, please take note of what Buell and Cal have said, which is that, as policy advocates, Lauren and I can talk about how this impacts people, but people who've been through it are the best advocates. And so we need your voices. So please stay active. With that, we'll close. Thanks for everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.